Welcome to our In Focus discussion tonight, the rise in domestic violence. The reasons behind DV are many and it's complex. Data shows COVID-19 and the pandemic plays a role in domestic violence. Tonight, we look at the numbers and what they mean for Utahns. Joining us tonight is Liz Solis from the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition and Jenn Oxborrow, the Executive Director of Allies with Families. Jenn, Liz, thank you for making some time and sharing your wisdom with us tonight.
It's great to be here. Thank you, Jason.
Yes, thank you for having us.
All right, so I want to get first to some numbers that we were able to pull today. So we're going to pull up this graphic here. Take a look at this because with domestic violence, we looked at the calls from Unified Police Department and the Salt Lake City Police Department and what they're dealing with. In 2020, you can see UPD saw more than 3,000 cases of domestic violence. And in 2021, it looks like it's down. But what police officers tell me is that's because Taylorsville left the Unified Police Department, and we're still working to get some of that information from Taylorsville this evening. But below that is the Salt Lake City Police Department statistics, and there you can see the caseload is starting to increase. That bottom number should say 2020 there, not 2021. So Liz, let's just start off with you here. The Utah Domestic Violence Coalition and the things that you're a part of, are you seeing a rise in domestic violence and calls for help through the LINKLine?
Yeah, so during 2020, we definitely saw an increase to the LINKLine as well as to the crisis lines across the state. We also saw an increase in LAP assessments, so the lethality assessment program that we utilize across the state. We did see those numbers go up. We're continuing to see that those numbers are pretty steady, although they were higher in the height of the pandemic.
Wow. Okay, Jenn, well, let's flip it over to you. What does this mean for Allies with Families? What do these trends mean for you folks?
Well, we work as a peer network across Utah, and we provide services directly in homes to families throughout the state. And we know that domestic violence and family violence are prevalent within the past 30 days within about 60% of the cases and families that we're working with. So we're really concerned about how isolation during the past year or additional stressors on families could play out in those situations and families.
Well, let's bounce off of that a little bit because we're going to talk a lot about isolation. So why do you think that there are so many domestic violence cases this year because of the isolation?
Well, I think isolation can play into the stress that's already there, into the power and control dynamics that are in place in a family. It can be harder to reach out. Also, you know, financial stressors are higher for families over the past year and a half too. So another thing too, Jason, that we think about is the lack of access to other family members, to teachers, or your pastor, child care providers who might notice that there's some changes within that family. They may be missing some of those important signs. So we may have fewer reports because of that as well.
Well, I want to talk about that in a little bit, but Liz, let's get over to you. Let's talk about the stories behind the numbers. How do these cases really affect families?
Well, I think we've had a very good example most recently with Gabby Petito as to how these cases affect families, and not just families, but the entire community. So when a domestic violence incident occurs, it doesn't just impact that direct individual or the abuser. It impacts everybody around them. It impacts law enforcement, the victim service providers, and it can tear a family apart. There's many times that families don't want to believe that that domestic violence is occurring. We know that many times those survivors and victims who are in those relationships, they don't want that domestic violence to occur, so they might be denying it still. So it can be a very disruptive situation for those who are directly involved, as well as those who are indirectly involved.
Well, Liz, we've done dozens of stories of this over the last year. I mean, probably hundreds throughout my career here in Utah with you. So let's talk about the family a little bit more, because this has a little bit more of an emotional impact on children that are witnessing the domestic violence.
Well, I think the one thing that's so concerning is when children witness domestic violence, they can begin to normalize that activity and that as being what a normal relationship might look like. So we do know that there is a pattern for some people who are in a family where there's violence to either be violent themselves or connect with someone who is violent. it can also create a very hard situation when maybe an older adult is finally leaving their partner, because the kids might decide that they don't understand it because the victim stayed for so long. Why now are they disrupting the family? Again, it has such a far-reaching effect, and I really think that's why we need to spend so much time focusing on the front end of it, get ahead of it early on, instead of always being reactive.
And Jen, I kind of want to keep talking about kids for just a second. You know, a lot of times with domestic violence situations, kids themselves feel like they're the problem. How can we avoid that?
Right. I think it's important to help children understand that it's not their responsibility. The dynamics in an adult relationship are the responsibility of the adults that are in that relationship, but that can be different for different age groups of children too. So knowing where to turn for free confidential help is really important. There are a lot of different resources. More and more every year there are great resources out there, especially catered to helping children understand this and supporting families as they achieve safety.
Okay, Jen and Liz, we want to talk about how this is a statewide issue, but I got to take a break right now. So we want you to stay right there because we're going to continue this discussion on the rise of domestic violence right after this break. Thanks for staying with us for our In Focus discussion tonight, the rise in domestic violence. We're joined by Liz Solis from the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition and Jenn Oxborrow, the Executive Director of Allies with Families. Before the break, I just kind of led into this being a statewide issue, domestic violence. And Jen, I want you to talk to me a little bit more about domestic violence and why it has become a Utah issue.
Domestic violence crosses all demographics, Jason. It's not limited to any one socioeconomic area. It really can affect anyone at any time. It doesn't matter what access to care you have. It doesn't matter what your background is or what your culture is. This is something that has far-reaching implications, and it's really serious in Utah. I think the resources here have historically been pretty limited, and there's a lot of stigma around domestic violence, so sometimes it's hard for people to reach out or even recognize what might be happening.
And it's something where like people can relate from, you know, here in the Valley to St. George. I know there's a lot of people down in St. George. I've been looking at the numbers down there in Washington County. So this is an issue that really centers around control. And Liz, I want to talk to you about how someone builds up enough strength to break that control of their domestically violent abuser.
Well, I think one of the primary things people need is support. They need somebody outside of that relationship who can talk with them, who will listen to them, who will believe them, who says, I believe in you, you can do this. And that person needs to be patient, because what we do know is that many times people don't leave right away. They may never leave that relationship, or they may eventually leave. So working with them, whether it's creating a safety plan or just helping to build up their confidence, letting them know, and it's gonna sound strange, though I will say it, that it's normal, like normalizing the situation, because so many of them think that they're the only people or person experiencing the violence the way that they are. And I think that it is so important that they know that that is not the case. There are a lot of other people who have experienced violence, though maybe not exactly as they have. They aren't alone. There is help out there.
I do want to talk about that normalization issue when we talk about intimate partner violence. But Jen, I want to talk to you about those loved ones who are seeing their family members, their friends in that bad relationship. How can they approach that topic with their friends and families?
Well, first of all, like Liz said, start by believing and tell them that you are there for them. Stay out of judgment. That's really hard sometimes. We look at this situation and we care about people and we want them to be safe. Sometimes the violence isn't as noticeable or isn't even there. It's more of an abusive situation. Emotional abuse, verbal abuse can be really, really difficult to recognize. So when someone comes to you, you want to say three things. I believe you. I'm sorry this has happened to you. And I want to help you find resources. And there's free confidential help available 24/7 throughout Utah.
Now, Liz, I'm going to flip this one over to you, because we know that there's a lot of women in Utah who are suffering from this abuse. Why do we know as journalists that a lot of these cases are unreported. How do we go about getting some more of these cases reported?
Well, I'd like to believe that some of the increases we're seeing in numbers is because there's been greater awareness about the resources out there. So that's one thing I'd like to believe. More people are calling 911. I want to commend the individual in Grand County who called 911 when they witnessed what was a domestic incident. That's so important, and I just think that that's one thing. I think it is being more reported. I still believe, though, that it is underreported. I know that there are people who they could be with someone a span of decades and maybe only contact law enforcement or a victim service provider a couple of times. And so making sure that they have those resources, letting them know that there's no judgment if they don't want to utilize the resource right away, if they are nervous about moving forward with perhaps charges. There's going to be victim advocates along the way, whether it's at a law enforcement agency or at a shelter. There's going to be victim advocates in the courts who can help them throughout that process.
Jen, we know that there is help out there, but for families staying at shelters, are they staying longer than expected?
We know that it can be difficult to access shelter-based care, but there are a range of services available. So you don't have to go to a shelter in order to get professional advocacy services, peer support services. There are a lot of different ways to engage in help. So you can reach out for free to find access to legal assistance, to housing assistance, to safety planning, and to children's advocacy services as well. And I just can't stress enough that you can decide for yourself if this is happening in your life or someone that you care about. You can decide for yourself what services are right to engage in.
And Liz, is the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition, I should say, I'm sorry about that, but are they seeing a strain on resources?
You know, we could always use more resources. Obviously, like I said earlier, we'd love to see more front-end work happen. That prevention, early intervention is probably going to be the best way we can get a handle on this. One of the things I would suggest is many of the victim service providers are the coalition as well. We get funding from the feds and from the state, and a lot of that is restricted. And so that limits sometimes how we can help people who are trying to leave an abusive situation. So if people can, it's great if they can donate, because those donated funds are unrestricted in most cases, and that allows us to be a little bit more creative. So as Jen mentioned, if somebody, however that person wants to find their path, we can help them with those unrestricted funds a lot more easier than we can with the other funds.
Okay, well, I want to talk about that, but I got to go to another commercial break. But right when we get back, we're going to continue our conversation on the rise of domestic violence, and we're going to talk about intimate partner violence, and we're going to touch on that Petito case right after this break. Welcome back to our third and final In Focus discussion tonight on the rise in domestic violence. Liz Solis and Jenn Oxborrow are both staying with us tonight, and we really do thank you for sharing your time with us. Liz, recently, the Gabby Petito case, it took the nation by storm. We've already talked about this a couple of different times. They're still looking for her boyfriend, Brian Laundrie. I want you to tell us, what is intimate partner violence?
Well, intimate partner violence is really very similar to domestic violence. Dating violence can fall into that category. It's just a different term to describe the relationship. I think many times with domestic violence, it is assumed that the people are married, living together in the home. I think there's some misnomers too with this domestic violence, because domestic violence isn't always with two people who are married. It could be an older adult and their adult child who may have a domestic violence situation. So intimate partner violence has all of the same signs, all of the same resources are available. The reality is it's just two individuals who are in an intimate relationship. They're partners and they're experiencing violence.
And Jen, we talked about this last week during one of my reports. We talked about intimate partner violence and Gabby and Brian and how they may have been in that type of relationship. Tell me why you believe that intimate partner violence built up over time in the Petito case.
Well, just from the limited view that I've had, and none of us really know exactly what was going on. We've only seen small snapshots into their relationship, but they talked about the stress that they were under. They talked about some of the stress that was related to ongoing problem solving on their trip across the country. They're a younger couple. I don't know how much experience they had with conflict resolution or healthy communication strategies, and these are all things that are learned sometimes over time in a relationship and through positive examples. So I don't know if they also knew about the resources that were around in any city that they're in. There is qualified mental health care available for people if they're struggling with their mental health, and sometimes that can be really tough for people to find, or they're afraid to reach out for help.
And Jen, another conversation that we had off camera is that a lot of young folks, they believe this is normal, that they normalize this, and we talked about this in the first segment with Liz a little bit. Why do younger people, or why do you find that younger people feel that it's normal to act this way with their couple and their partner?
I hear people talking about, you know, this passionate relationship, or this is just how we are, we're really intense, and I just can't say this loudly enough and clearly enough that violence and aggression is never okay. And if that's happening in a relationship, there are ways to get help and find a better way to communicate and problem solve before things take a power and control turn. But as Liz said, you know, a lot of times this example has been prevalent in a family environment, or the situation that a young person has grown up around, and so they may not know or recognize some of those warning signs. Not always. I think sometimes people grow up around violence and aggression, abusive situations, and have a lot of protective factors, and so they tend to be really resilient or figure out how to have a healthy relationship. And do some positive conflict resolution. But I do hear this a lot from younger adults, that that this sort of intensity is sort of being minimized and normalized. And I really appreciate the question, Jason. We need to be talking about this.
Well, I want you to keep talking about it, Jen, so stick with me right now. But Allies with Family, how are they currently helping people get out of these types of relationships?
Most of the families that we work with are working with us because they've had some intersection with the Division of Child and Family Services or Juvenile Justice Services, or they've reached out to a local mental health authority, and we partner them with people who have a lived experience who can help guide them through that process and be a sort of warm line to them. So it's not clinical care, it's a complement oftentimes to clinical care and other types of resources. Someone who can be your sponsor, be your mentor, understand what it's like to go through sometimes the hardest moments in your life, and really help you find resources and solutions that make sense for you.
All right, Liz or Jen, I want both of you, or either of you, decide which one wants to take this question, but we know the Moab police chief is taking a leave of absence, and this is all after the Petito case, and a lot of people are questioning the Moab police officers this evening, and we want to ask you both, did the Moab police officers do everything that they could do in this case?
That's hard to say from the small slice of information that we have about this. From what I saw as a licensed mental health professional, I saw them use skill to de-escalate. They treated people with respect. They separated them. I believe they tried to connect them to resources, community-based resources, and they really respected their right to self-determination. You know, sometimes we see this and we want so much for someone to separate or leave or end a relationship, but it's really up to that person, and we have to stay out of judgment if we want to stay engaged with them. So I thought, from what Moab police shared with us in their body cam footage, which I commend them for sharing that as well. I think that's a really transparent approach, and it helps us all understand. I thought that they tried really hard to do a good job with a really difficult situation.
And Liz, you worked with law enforcement previously. How do officers approach these types of cases so that they can have the best outcome come out?
Well, I know at the agency I worked with, they had regular trainings that they took throughout the year, daily training bulletins, I think is what they were called. And myself as an employee, I actually took those bulletins too. And the reason behind that was so that we're familiar with policy. And domestic violence response is part of policy at every law enforcement agency. So you take this training scenario so that you know what you need to do, how to respond, how to connect people. They're very familiar with their victim service providers in their area. The lethality assessment program that I mentioned earlier is offered statewide. The law enforcement agencies partner with the victim service providers or other providers in that area who can connect people immediately with resources if they're ready. And I think that, as Jen stated, I think the Moab PD, based on what I saw, did a lot of things right. And we're such a judgmental society. It would be nice if we could start to focus on the things that they did right, and even, you know, a lot of the things that Gabby did right. And then instead of focusing on why Gabby stayed, let's focus on why Brian was doing what he was doing. You know, let's reframe that question, put it where it needs to be, and that's on the abuser. Why are they abusing? Why don't they stop?
Yeah, I mean, it's a deep conversation. And Jen, one of the things that I want to ask you is you work with policymakers. And since we're talking about policy, let's talk about Utah law. Should there be an adjustment to the law so that we can see a better outcome so cases like Petito's don't come about again?
You know, domestic violence is so broad, Jason. It's really difficult to make a law that works for every type of domestic violence case. And domestic violence statutes are defined individually by each state. So I do think it is worth taking a closer look at the law that specifies how law enforcement respond to situations like Gabby's, and make sure that we have a modern law that's relevant. You know, technology changes, data helps guide good policy, and we should be taking a look at this closely. Currently in Utah, our law says that officers shall arrest a predominant aggressor. And so I worried when I saw the body cam footage that they might have to cite or arrest Gabby when she was talking about scratching Brian, and we just never know if that was done in self-defense. That can be really difficult for an officer to determine. So again, I commend them for staying connected, continuing a respectful conversation, connecting them to resources. But yeah, I do hope that our lawmakers will take a close look at that law and make sure that it's relevant.
Well, legislative session is right around the corner. I know people don't want to push that way, but it is coming up very quickly. So you've been hearing from Liz Solis from the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition. She's right in the middle of your screen. And Jenn Oxborrow, the Executive Director of Allies with Families. Thank you both for being with us tonight and having this really difficult conversation.
Thank you, Jason.
And don't forget, we'd love to hear from you about the show. So we invite you to join our Facebook group by searching ABC4 in Focus, or send us an email. It's right there on your screen at abc or infocus@abc4.com.